You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars.
Hello everybody, today I'm driving one of the VAG Empire's oft-forgotten hot hatchbacks, the Audi A3 3.2 Quattro. The idea of putting a big engine into a small car is a reasonably old one. Home mechanics were doing it in the 1970s with their Anglias and Capris, and then later manufacturers started doing it as well. The 1.9 litre that went into the 205 GTI was considered a relatively large lump at the time. As things moved on, the small cars did get slightly bigger, but so did the engines. This, I think, reached a peak in the early noughties, and VW provided us with several examples of that formula. Perhaps the best known is the Golf R32, which existed in Mark IV and Mark V guise. Audi also dropped that same engine in the TT, and of course, the A3 as well. Something I've always found rather curious is that with VW, the R32 was very much the top of the Golf tree. But over at Audi, things weren't quite so clear. So for example, you had the later TT Quattro Sport, which was powered instead by the smaller turbocharged engine. The VR6 powered car existed and was actually about the same money, but wasn't touted as the ultimate incarnation. Same thing really for the A3. While the 3.2 existed, the S3 got a turbocharged 4. Then when the RS3 turned up, it was sporting a turbocharged 5-cylinder. This left the 3.2 in a very unusual position. Even more confusingly, this is called the A3 Sport, not to be confused with the Sportback, which is the 5-door version of the same car. To look at, and indeed sit in this, you would never know you were in anything other than a regular, plain old A3, with some nice options like these leather seats, but that's about it. That being said, there is still an awful lot to like about this car, this specific one in particular. This car has been brought to me today by Cameron, and he's a very interesting chap because he's spent the last 3 decades of his life in the cut and thrust world of international finance, but realised that at heart he is a proper petrol head. Not so long ago, a search for an E46 3 Series BMW for himself resulted in a bit of a brainwave, because he realised that there is a market for people out there much like himself that want cars a bit like this, reasonably affordable, modern classic type stuff that isn't particularly shouty, showy or expensive, yet they want a very good example of the car with a decent history and provided with some decent service to back it up. So he thought, you know what, sod it, I'm going to be that guy. And this is a car that's been brought to me as an example of the kind of thing that he sells. The majority of his stock at the moment is BMW, and German stuff is what he knows and likes. If you want to know a little bit more, the business is called Provenance Cars, and naturally I'll put a link in the description. Now, what's the turning circle like? Oh, quite good actually. Never a given in these things. This car has just over 19,000 miles on the clock, and it's up for around £10,000. That makes it considerably cheaper than many of the R32s out there, including some which have got pretty serious mileage on. I've driven a Mark V R32 before, haven't experienced a Mark IV. In fact, I don't believe I've ever driven a Mark IV Golf of any description. But you can't deny the fact that people are asking pretty strong money now for them. The question, of course, is whether it's worth going for something like this or sticking instead with the fairly well-loved Golf. If you do like a car that's a little bit fancier and shoutier outside and in, I would certainly say the Golf is worth having, particularly in 3-door guise with the beautiful wingback seats, and in that fantastic blue colour. I think they are stunning. This, meanwhile, is so plain that I in fact just drove past Cameron, who's out in the 968, and I'm not sure he realised that it was me driving his car coming the other way. The only thing non-standard about this car is the wheels. It apparently came with some slightly dubious alloys on it, and so he put these on in their place. I have to say, it wears them really well. Yes, I know it's the very typical VAG scene look with the BBS, but it does suit the car really quite well. It reminds me very much of the BMW Motorsport alloys you find on stuff like the 320SI and the 130i LE. You could get these cars with either a 6-speed manual or the then fairly new and fancy Dsg Gearbox. In its early days, the Dsg did gain a reputation for unreliability, chiefly down to the mechatronic unit which controls how the box actually works. These days, if one does fail, it's not a particularly expensive fix at around £700 to £800. Beyond that though, it's actually rather nice to use. Thus far, I've been driving the car in normal, automatic mode, and it is very pleasant. The joy of a Dsg box though is that it can do both the automatic thing nicely and also provide you with a more engaging drive when you want to take over yourself. That I'm going to do in a moment. The engine up front, though badged by some as a V6, is in fact the same VR6 layout that you find in the R32. Very clever configuration, and it has a rather distinct soundtrack. It provides around 240 horsepower, about 237 pound-foot of torque, it's about 320 newton meters, and was down on the S3 by about 10 horsepower. That also had then a little bit more torque by virtue of being turbocharged. Some people did modify these cars, and in fact, many moons ago, I drove a crazy eBay turboed screamer pipe example which shot flames out of the bonnet, and a video that, to be honest, died a total death on my channel. However, it was rather entertaining. The funniest thing about that car was that despite all of its bluster and noise and shoutiness and stripped interior, it actually just drove like a fairly normal example, just a little bit peppier. The sort of customer Cameron is aiming for is likely to want something reasonably standard, and the truth is that the modding community tends to be much more interested in the turbocharged cars because you can get so much more out of them for so much less. However, now we find ourselves on an entertaining road, let's see if the 3.2 can still make a decent showing of itself. Well, on these sorts of roads, pace is certainly not a problem. The engine pulls very smoothly, linearly, and being naturally aspirated, has fantastic throttle response. Today is dry, grip levels seem absolutely fine, and the gearbox is pretty responsive too. In fact, I would go so far as to say this responds a lot better than the brand spanking new RS6 that have just handed back to Audi with its 8-speed ZF. There are reasons for that, and if you want to know what they are, check that video out. Where this car does fall apart is that its designers clearly struggle to find an appropriate balance between sportiness and luxury. It was around this time that I would say Audi as a company was struggling just a little bit to find their voice within the VW group. The idea has always been, of course, that they are the premium, more upmarket brand, but the fact is the results haven't always made it look that way. Even the B7 RS4, one of my all-time favourite performance saloons, doesn't feel particularly upmarket, even compared to this, which is filled with scratchy, nasty plastic and the kind of thing you really wouldn't expect on an A3 today, certainly not a top-level one. These were not cheap cars when new, £25,000, and Cameron actually bought one when they were in production. It's one of the reasons he was so keen to get this example in. You can tell very, very clearly that this particular car has been exceedingly well looked after. Everything feels very tight, in good condition. It all pretty much seems to work. There aren't really any creaks and rattles to write home about, and the suspension feels absolutely perfect. Perfect, though, in the respect that I believe it's behaving exactly as designed. Sadly, it is the suspension and the steering that are letting this car down. When you're driving around normally, you'd probably say that this car is just a little bit too firm. Over smooth surfaces, it's absolutely fine, but if there is anything beyond the mildest of imperfections in the road, it does seem to crash into them a little bit more than you would expect it to. It's never uncomfortable, it never makes you go, whoa, or anything like that, but it just has a surprising level of firmness that you wouldn't expect in a car like this. This is very typical of many performance cars from the 90s and noughties, particularly stuff like this, which was trying to be both practical and sporty. This is the era that gifted us, I would say, some of the stiffest cars from factory. Later on, adaptive dampers became considerably more widespread, the technology improved, and then you had cars which, on the one hand, could absolutely hammer the Nürburgring, but on the other, could massage you all the way down the M1. And a firm suspension is not an inherently bad thing if the car then rewards you with handling and steering feel that is appropriately involving. But this does not. The steering is exactly how everybody thinks all Audis are, when the truth is many are quite good, even the modern ones. While the speed of the rack is very nicely judged and there's a good weighting to the car, even at sort of 20 or 30 mile an hour, there isn't much in the way of feedback or texture coming through the wheel ever. This is not unique to the A3 or Audis at all. But when you then start to press on and you think the car should hunker down and really attack the bends, particularly with its all-wheel drive system, it just doesn't want to seem to do that. If you were expecting a Subaru in a dinner jacket, you're gonna be very disappointed. The pace of the thing is absolutely fine, and the reality is, for most people, this will be good enough. But for the discerning petrol head who wants accuracy, they want feel, they want feedback, they want interaction, the car is sadly lacking. This being said, now is a good opportunity to try it on some slightly faster roads and see if it behaves itself any better when the tarmac is less demanding. I'm not really bobbing my head about deliberately there. That's just the kind of feeling that you get from this car. You drive this and you'll believe everything anyone has ever said about Audis, their desire to understeer and everything else, because that's exactly what this does. You start piling the speed on, you get to the pointy end of the national speed limit and the car just does want to wash wide. Grip levels today are the best they will have been for some time. It's 13 degrees, it's sunny, it's dry. We've just come to the end of one storm, we're due another two, so that means everything's been blown off the road and the surface, while not perfect, is as good as we're likely to get for February. It's never dangerous or worrying, and when you reach the limits, it simply slowly starts to wash a little bit wide, which is a clear sign that you should back off. It is, I suspect, possible that with careful modification, the right geometry, so on and so forth, you will be able to unlock a much more entertaining car. But I think that's going to take quite some work. If you're willing to live with a far more flawed vehicle, something like an Alfa Romeo 147 GTA is going to give you far more excitement as a driver, but it's going to come at the cost of an interior which is really rather drab. And whereas 10 grand will pick you up a very good one of these, it will get you an okay 147 GTA. The brakes, surprisingly large ones at the front, are very decent, seem to have no trouble bringing the car to a stop, and that's handy because these are not light, around 1.5 tons. In terms of the boring practical stuff, yes, it will be a bit thirstier having the 3.2 litre in it, but not horrendous, pretty much the same as most other cars of this type made at the time, and I suspect not that much worse than the turbocharged ones, particularly if you've breathed on them. Rear seat space is decent, there's plenty of legroom behind me. Boot space is very good for the kind of car that it is, and it's sized very nicely. Take the badges off this and nobody would ever know what it was. For some, that'll be a reason not to buy, and others, that'll be the best thing about the entire car. Every time I feature a car which has more or less any sort of modification, someone will always crawl out of the woodwork to tell me, why didn't you drive a totally standard, pristine example like it had just come out of a showroom 15 years ago? And the fact is, there really aren't that many cars out there that fit that description anymore. Certainly not stuff like this. So I'm very grateful to Cameron for bringing this car out, because it's really nice to get to drive and enjoy an example of something that clearly has been extremely well cared for. The previous owner did just over 19,000 miles in this car, yet they took this to Audi for servicing 14 times. Yeah, this has had 3 sets of plugs in it. Absolutely fantastic. So if you are in the market for this kind of thing, a fairly sensible, practical car, which still has a little bit of fun about it, there's still something a little bit different or unusual about it, it would make an excellent buy and a very sensible alternative to a Golf R32. It's just a shame that in terms of driving dynamics, this would have its backside handed to it by the Proton Satria Neo that I drove a couple of weeks ago. And it's cars like this which gave Audi their reputation for understeery, uninvolving, wishy-washy drivers' cars that unfortunately haunts them to this very day, despite the fact they don't really make many cars that feel like this now. That then, I think, is enough from me for now. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.